This week, while thinking about sugar and the water required to grow it, the Arrow Rock Dam in southwestern Idaho came up in my search around the resources under the umbrella of the National Park Service. This dam and the exhibits around it reminded me that the NPS covers all manner of places, objects, and signposts in history we normally don't think about. The complex and endlessly interesting people, places, and things that the National Park Service is responsible for are once again far more vast than I had ever considered. The Arrow Rock Dam doesn't actually have anything to do with sugar cane, but it is an important player in that other source of American sugar, the sugar beet. And this portion of Idaho was one of the areas that took to growing sugar beet as a way to supplement the sugar supply of the United States as we were resorting ourselves as we expanded rapidly and in all of the changes caused by the Civil War. It was a way to supply sugar to the northwest of the United States, a portion that, as mostly territories and not states, was last on the list of where railroads were built and luxury stuff was shipped. A gold strike on the headwaters of the Boise River in 1862 led to the establishment of a town in this area of notably rugged hills and valleys. But gold doesn't last long, and mining communities never lead to stable communities. Agriculture, on the other hand, often does. And since these valleys had been carved over the eons by rivers, the lower portion, or the bottom land of the valleys, looked desirable for raising the popular field crops of the time. But one thing many farmers discovered to their dismay is that the growing season up here in higher elevation and further north Idaho is shorter and wetter than wheat and most other grains prefer, which makes it excellent ground for root crops, especially potatoes and this newfangled crop, the sugar beet. Part of what makes the building of the Arrow Rock Dam so interesting, and thus a worthwhile pursuit of the National Park Service, is that the why, the how, and the accompanying governmental shenanigans are a great way to get to know the political climate that prevailed in late 19th century federal politics. The people living there wanted to grow crops, but uncertain rains made it difficult. Thus, they wanted to engineer the river to make it easier to tap into the flow in dry years. However, there was little interest in digging big holes for just a bunch of farmers. On the other hand, this is the same age the railway is coming through the area, and timber interests did want access to the land and a workforce to make the railway work. So there was political will and some money behind getting the infrastructure up and running. But the change that really made the dam happen was the spreading of electricity throughout the country. The shift in political will, the graft, the trickery, but also the engineering and ingenuity that went into this dam might look familiar to modern times in some ways and unrecognizable in others. But if anything, the fact that the dream of this dam lies with a gold mine and sugar beets on one hand, and brought electrical lights, local running water, a hotel, a hospital to an area that until then had been all buckets, fireplaces, and candles, is a testament to the wide range of technology that coexisted in the U.S. at the end of the 19th century. And of course, the dam, canal, and irrigation network the Arrow Rock Dam is part of made Idaho a produce powerhouse for the sorts of items like potatoes, peas, barley, mint, and of course, sugar beets that places like California cannot grow. So to see a piece of history that is still a working part of our food and power producing network, drive up into the wild mountains outside of Boise, Idaho, and see the Arrow Rock Dam in Idaho City, Idaho. Episode 175, New American Sugar. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how America did and did not rearrange its life around sugar when the rules about slavery changed, and how we dealt with changes in sugar distribution and consumption now that the country was a whole continent wide, with a thin metal spine connecting both sides. To follow the trail left by this lust for the sweet stuff, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the per capita consumption of sugar rose markedly during the 19th century. In 1822, it's estimated that a single person consumed just under 10 pounds of sugar every year. Realistically, this was skewed to the wealthy, but it still gives a good idea that if spread out evenly among everyone, we maxed out at about 9.5 pounds or just over 4 kilos of sugar consumed by a person each year. By 1860, that amount had more than tripled to about 32 pounds a person or 14.5 kilos. And by the end of the century, we will be at over 50 pounds a person. That's 23 kilos to the rest of the world. Since sugar has always been a high-effort crop, it consumes a lot of energy, human, animal, coal or petroleum, electrical, what have you, and requires some serious mechanical and chemical know-how, the consumption of sugar was a reasonable indicator of wealth for centuries. If you had money and resources to spare first as an individual and now as a society, sugar was available. If not, then no refined sugar for you. And unlike salt, we do not have to have it. The sugar and other carbohydrate molecules that our body breaks apart and uses as its main energy source are available in most food we eat made of plants. And so while you don't have to have refined sugar, you do need to have sugars that our body can break down into glucose because our brain checks out very quickly in the absolute absence of glucose. Milk is also a great source of sugar our brains and muscles need, which is why all mammals start their babies off with their own personal brand. But refined sugar, the stuff separated from the original plant matrix and made into a shelf-stable version that can sit around and wait till you need it, that is a product of high technology. And as the United States adopted more and more technological processes into food production, transport, and storage, our ability to produce and refine sugar also increased. That went hand in hand with making more sugar available, making sugar cheaper, and making it a part of everyone's lives all the time. For a history of sugar in America's early days, and even earlier than that, head back and listen to episodes 4, 5, 45, 94, 116, and 37 for a fun rum crossover episode. That way, I can mostly talk about modern sugar right now instead and not bore the people who started at the beginning. Because sugar has always been a high-effort product, in the days before large mechanical machines, it required concentrating human effort down into a sludge of misery to produce sugar as a large, profitable crop. As a large, money-making industry, it started in the Mediterranean and then became a Caribbean product. But as the United States broke away from England, the U.S. stopped allowing British sugar imports or made them more expensive by layering a tariff on top of the sale price that buyers would have to pay. Then, the island of Saint-Domingue freed itself from French rule in 1804 and became Haiti, which made it no longer a dependable source of sugar. It was during those years that sugar production moved into the delta region of the Mississippi River, starting in the 1700s, and then into the swampy lowlands of Florida, starting in the 1820s, once that area had been taken from the weakening Spanish Empire. Americans would continue to import molasses to fulfill our thirst for rum, and to season our cornmeal mush, as much of the locally produced American molasses became food for cows and the enslaved population. But much of the American hunger for the sweet stuff had to be satisfied by American-grown sugar and the boiling of maple sap in the north, as well as some early ventures into Cuba. And lest we forget, there was also more expensive sugar coming from the coast of Brazil. See, we could buy sugar from Brazil because we weren't mad at the Portuguese. Anyway, with the expansion of the American territory to the west, especially to the north and west, none of the land was useful for expanding the sugarcane crop. But that weirdo experimental crop funded by the Prussian ruler Frederick II and promoted and expanded by the French, desperate in the face of their loss of the sugar and coffee factory that had been Saint-Domingue and became Haiti, the sugar beet was a good bet for those headed westward ho. The sugar beet grew quite nicely right alongside that pioneering potato. In season 4, I talk about the introduction of the sugar beet, but for the most part, in the United States, it was really a weirdo crop, at least up until the Civil War. There just hadn't been all that much interest in processing and refining it. The money and the power had all been with the cane. But with the end of legal chattel slavery in the American states, the Louisiana and Florida sugar industries temporarily stumbled badly. This left the door open for other sugar suppliers. The sugar beet, especially in areas further away from traditional sugar fields, looked really enticing. Sugar beets were also inviting since sugar processing was becoming more mechanized. Setting up your sugar plant took more capital and more expertise to be able to compete on the world stage that was the sugar industry. And this also had sugar barons and wannabe sugar barons looking outside the United States for new fields to till. At this point in the late 19th century, we are firmly in the age of the land axe and train-assisted migration, though the travel by wagon and the Oregon Trail type stuff is in full effect. But all of these places people were going to were too cold and or too arid to grow sugarcane, and not a single new locale in the rapidly expanding territory of the United States had the workforce required to plant, fertilize, harvest, and process industrial quantities of sugarcane. But beets, they are a different plant. First of all, the rush to process after harvest does not exist with beets the way it does with sugarcane. Since sugarcane is a grass, it's expecting to make the sugar and then rapidly deploy the sugar to either grow more leaves or root runners or create seeds for spreading more plants. So it must be cut at peak sweetness, then crushed before the sugar in the cane starts to get converted to starch. It is a process that, once begun, must be completed at a relentless pace, or the sugar literally goes bad. Incidentally, if you're curious about how it looks when sugarcane grows, it really has a growth pattern just like grass in fields. Sweet stems, blade leaves, and root runners. It's a fun little thing to track down. Beets, on the other hand, are root vegetables. They are made to store things. In fact, sugar beets are mainly harvested then and now once temperatures drop below a certain threshold. As long as beets are cool, they retain their sugar. They only start to lose sugar when things warm up, and that sugar gets converted to starches that could be used for other jobs. So if anything, you can have a bunch of small farmers growing beets and then transporting them to a mill in colder weather at leisurely ox pace. And then they can be processed at a sane rate rather than at breakneck and dangerous speeds during one very short time of the year, like you have to do with the cane. The first sugar beet factory opened in California in 1870, a long way away from the cane fields and in an area where there were people with money, often gold money or railroad money, to invest. As factories spread around the northwestern rim of the country, many of them in the Great Lakes region, they were largely run by German immigrants bringing know-how from the old country. However, since they were from a different continent with different weather patterns, they often turned out to be bad at picking areas that would be good for long-term beet growing. This meant that beet sugar would continue to be a local rather than national or global product for America. In Europe, the beet sugar industry was well developed, and when the U.S. started ramping up its sugar consumption, it would actually begin to import beet sugar from Germany and other European countries that began to deploy beet sugar as a state-subsidized export industry. At this same time, the sugar beet production in America was expanding. There was the other group of people looking beyond the borders of the U.S. for places they could run sugar plantations outside of the laws enacted within the borders of the U.S. On the East Coast, this meant Puerto Rico and Cuba became targets for sugar plantations, and on the West Coast, eyes fell on the isolated whaling outpost of Hawaii, or the Sandwich Islands. Now, I will not detail the discovery, recognition, exploitation, colonization, and overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdoms in this episode, but I think I will do a bonus episode on it since the experience of Hawaii is pretty much a speed run of the American experience, all on one little compact set of isolated volcanic islands. And that will give me the chance to talk about the many other ways sugarcane was used by everyone who put it in a canoe and headed east over the Pacific instead of over land and west into Asia. Now, what has been hanging over my head and getting me excited ever since I first read Sydney Mintz's book, Sweetness and Power, is that Hawaii is where sugar finally meets itself. This is where sugarcane has circled the globe and come back together after splitting for the east and west from New Guinea thousands of years ago. So, anyway, there was Hawaii, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And as far as I'm concerned, the middle of the Pacific is a very large area. It's like anywhere that takes about a week to get to from a major landmass at modern boat cruising speeds. And that is a large area. So yeah, Hawaii is out there minding its own business, being populated by intrepid explorers who figured out how to make boats, navigate, and set up entire civilizations with no metal. Were the societies hierarchical? Sure. Was population control rigid? Absolutely. But when sailors from continental ports, Europe and Asia, ran across these islands, they immediately labeled them paradise. And departing them could often lead to discipline problems, if not outright mutiny on the European ships. Europeans and Americans will go on to commit a long list of crimes, both violent and financial, to dominate, purchase, and control many of these islands, including the Hawaiian Isles. Once definitively discovered and mapped by Captain Cook, the Hawaiian Islands were subsequently plundered for local products like sandalwood, sea cucumbers, aka bêche de mer, which translates to sea worm or sea animal, koa hardwood, for decorative coral and shells, and for coconut products. As these items ran out, the last thing the islands had was enviably predictable weather and an astonishing amount of fresh water, both from the sky and underground, at least on the windward side. Possibly more importantly, now that steam-powered sea travel was prevalent, so travel routes and times were predictable, this archipelago of islands had a protectorate-type relationship with the United States, but was definitely not of the United States. The result was that American citizens could show up with enough cash and do more or less whatever they wanted, and they didn't have to worry about competing with other colonization attempts from other nations, the way they did in the Caribbean. In 1810, the Hawaiian archipelago was recognized as an independent kingdom, but it was already being eyed as a new outpost for American land schemes. When the slave-powered sugar industry in the U.S. collapsed, sugar plantations were established and then expanded on these islands. So with the use of steam-powered ships and their coal boilers, the fact that Hawaii was way out there, away from much law at all, made it a perfect place for the sugar industry to pick up where Louisiana and Florida were stumbling. While sugarcane is not native to Hawaii, it was imported there over 1,000 years earlier by the first Hawaiian canoes, so it was endemic to the island. Proof of concept for Hawaii to be a giant sugar plantation was all over the place. However, the 40 or so varieties of ko, or sugarcane, being grown in the islands for a wide variety of purposes were not the type the plantation owners needed to send through the machinery of the sugar industry and make into shelf-stable crystals. Much like the corn of pre-contact America, sugarcane was food, but also a major material of life. It was for construction, for medicine, and for spiritual existence. To become an industrial crop, both cane and corn would have to be made less variable. When the sugar barons arrived, Hawaii and other islands of Pacific volcanic origin were self-sufficient for food and the materials of life, largely because there's no other option. But in a few years, large numbers of both American farmers and slave and indentured labor would be imported, throwing the careful balance of population versus food supplies right off a cliff. To make things worse, much of the arable land used to grow food would be converted to growing the export crop for sugar. Food stocks would be further reduced by a combination of overfishing by the expanded population and water pollution due to the waste products and silt from the ever-expanding cane fields, repeating many of the problems of the Caribbean sugar islands in the previous century. But the Hawaiian Islands also experienced a special problem. Having been so isolated from the rest of land, it was vulnerable in unique ways to the invasion of all manner of viruses, of bacteria, insects, rats, cats, and other life forms that found the ecosystems of the islands a paradise for them as well. These islands that had fed themselves and maintained a balance of pretty good margins found themselves sick and dying under an onslaught of diseases. The human population of the island was reduced by 80 or 90% from the pre-contact population. And now they were in need of imported food. But the profitability of the sugar exported from the island would make all the importation of a workforce and food possible. So yes, the entire ecosystem and way of life on the islands would be uprooted, and it would concentrate great wealth and political power in the hands of a few men. An enormous underclass of workers, kept in miserable conditions, would be required to support it, and an entirely unnecessary product would be produced that people would flock to pay for because it brought them pleasure. Again. But what makes this a particularly United States story is that while sugar has been grown from New Guinea across Asia, Northern Africa, and Europe, and South America, and each one has incorporated sugar into its cuisine to a greater or lesser extent, the United States, despite dedicating a decent amount of land and water to the project, will be a major sugar importer, and definitely the largest per capita sugar importer and consumer from the late 1800s to the present. England and the British Empire will import and use quite a bit as well, but the United States will take over the spot as the largest consumer of sugar, cane, beet, and now corn, and maintain it into the present. And the main reason wasn't that we use so much sugar in our homes. Now, granted, the advent of glass canning jars and home fruit preservation and liquor distillation in the latter part of the 19th century will rapidly bump up our home sugar use. It is the advent of manufactured food that really makes America the greatest sugar consumer on the planet. While England started with a good lead as a packaged and manufactured food maker, an important adjunct to its far-flung empire that needed transportable foodstuffs to send and sell all around the globe, the U.S., with its seemingly endless land and resources, rapidly caught up and then surpassed Britain. While the British Empire concentrated on extremely shelf-stable foods with an eye on the practical and nutritious, the U.S. leaned into treats and items that could be mass-produced and consumed in cities and large towns. Yes, there are exceptions to everything, but as a trend, the U.S. was looking for products that were treats and luxuries to market domestically. And these turned more and more to sugar as both an ingredient and a preservative. The foods of energy and daily nutrition were provided at home. The treats, these were more and more created and prepared and sold outside of the home. Penny candy, sugar sticks, horehound lumps, ice creams, and sherbets. The disease-spreading penny licks. I'll explain that later, I promise. Sweet tea, frosted cakes, sugared fruits, bottled, canned, and dried. Chocolates as gifts for your sweetheart and practical additions to exploration. The explosion of terrible distilled liquor with no purpose but drunkenness, and the money to be earned as a result. Syrups to go in sparkling water to make sodas and seltzers as the Prohibition movement moved along. Faster rising bread, dependably strong vinegar for making sauces and ketchups and relishes and pickles, and the gift salt and sugar gave to manufactured foods when you want each and every batch to taste as much like the one before and the one after. These were all ways sugar worked its way into our diets, even when we weren't thinking about consuming sugar specifically. It is in this age when we are growing and importing and inventing and perfecting new sugars, and more people are moving away from farms and moving away from growing their own food to work in other industries to make other things, that America begins its journey of consuming invisible sugar, The late 19th century is when sugar starts to be woven into the structure of the country as something we can't see, but it seems to touch almost everything. For the late 19th century is also the age of the rise of trusts. Trusts are combinations of members of industries that control the manufacture, the prices, and distribution of all manner of commodities in American life at this point. Railroads and steel trusts are well known, but they also existed to control milk, rubber, cottonseed oil, envelopes, elevators, oilcloth, petroleum, meat, glass, and fur as well. And the sugar trusts are part of the game. They have influence that controls laws and tariffs and subsidies or bounties paid to sugar farmers and refiners. In fact, by 1887, 90% of the manufacture and sale of granulated or white cane sugar is under the control of a sugar trust. This consolidation will affect not only sugar prices, but land sales, access to water rights, and will add to the corruption that will engulf American politics in the first quarter of the 20th century. I mean, Teapot Dome, we should all read about it right now. Through all of these mechanisms, by the end of the 19th century, the amount of total sugar consumed by the country had more than doubled. But the population had also markedly increased through immigration and families spreading out. All the same, by that time, the individual consumption had crossed the over 50 pounds per year per person mark. And for the first time, the majority of the world's sugar production had shifted from cane on Caribbean islands and coastal Brazil to beet sugar produced in continental Europe. The sugar production in the Caribbean and coastal Brazil hadn't stopped, it had just slowed. It was the rapid mechanization of sugar production in Europe that had overtaken where it was slowing due to the choking off of the transportation of African slaves. But a large, poorly paid workforce was still needed to make sugar work. So slaves and indentured workers were now coming from China, from Portugal, Brazil, Japan, the Philippines, and Korea to fill the spaces in the expanding Pacific sugar world. With the growth of mechanized milling and eventually harvesting and planting, conditions for workers would move from deadly to merely miserable, and people would live to tell the tale and fight for better working conditions. But at this point, at the end of the 19th century, sugar is a force that continues to shape the world, and now America, in many cases, is holding the wheel. Next week, while the idea of sugar is what drove much of the old world investment into the development of the United States, it never would have been possible without the nutritional support of corn in the new country. So now we will watch as corn starts to transform from survival food into big business. Thanks for listening. You can check the show notes for more information on the books I mentioned. From waffles to ranch dressing, there are so many American foods that have fascinating origins, both inside and out beyond the borders of this country. Now I'm closing in on modern times, but until then, let your friends know that we are exploring the past of America's food and how we got this way. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And as always, I love hearing what you have to say in your reviews. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.